There's a strange feeling that visits you late at night. You've achieved things. You've checked boxes. You have a life that looks good on paper. And yet, beneath it all, there's a quiet hum of dissatisfaction you can't name. A sense that something essential is missing. That you're living someone else's script. That the person you show the world isn't quite the person you are. Carl Jung knew this feeling intimately. And he spent his entire life trying to understand why so many people who seem to have everything still feel hollow inside. The answer he found is uncomfortable, because it suggests that your unhappiness isn't circumstantial. It's not about your job, or your relationship, or your bank account. It's about something far deeper. Something you've been running from since childhood. Something hiding in the architecture of your own mind. Jung called it the shadow. And he believed that until you face it, you'll never be whole. Imagine for a moment that you're not one person. You're a collection of voices, impulses, memories, desires, and fears, some of which you've spent your entire life trying to silence. You've built a personality, a public face, a version of yourself that's acceptable. That gets along. That fits in. That makes sense to other people. But everything you pushed away in order to build that person didn't disappear. It went underground. It became the shadow. The part of you that you refuse to acknowledge. The anger you're not allowed to feel. The desires you're too ashamed to admit. The selfishness, the cruelty, the weakness, the strangeness you've learned to hide. And Jung understood that this shadow doesn't just sit quietly in the basement of your psyche. It leaks, it sabotages. It surfaces in your dreams, in your sudden irrational reactions, in the people you irrationally hate, in the patterns you keep repeating without knowing why. Your unhappiness, Jung would say, is the shadow knocking. And the more you ignore it, the louder it gets. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, the son of a rural pastor. His childhood was lonely, strange, filled with vivid dreams and a sense that the world adults described didn't match the one he actually lived in. He felt split. There was the boy who went to school, who was polite, who did what he was told. And then there was another boy, older, stranger, who lived in a secret inner world that no one else could see. This split never left him, and it became the foundation of his life's work. He studied medicine, then psychiatry, and eventually became a protege of Sigmund Freud. For a time, they were close. Freud saw Jung as his intellectual heir, but Jung couldn't accept Freud's insistence that everything came down to sex and repression. Jung saw something else. He saw that the human psyche was far more complex, far more mythological, far more mysterious than Freud's mechanics allowed. So they split, painfully, publicly, and Jung descended into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. A period of intense psychological crisis where he withdrew from the world, explored his dreams, painted strange mandalas, dialogued with inner figures that felt as real as people. He was walking the edge of madness, and he knew it. But he also knew that on the other side of that madness was something essential. A truth that couldn't be found in textbooks or theories. A truth that could only be found by going inward, no matter how terrifying that journey became. What he discovered changed psychology forever. Jung realized that most people spend their lives building a mask. He called it the persona. It's the role you play. The good employee, the dutiful child, the charming friend, the responsible adult. The persona isn't fake exactly. It's functional. It helps you navigate society, meet expectations, avoid conflict. But the persona is not you. It's a costume. And the tragedy is that most people mistake the costume for their identity. They spend so much energy maintaining the mask that they forget there's a face underneath. And the face underneath? It's messy. It's contradictory. It's not always kind or rational or acceptable. It contains things you've been taught to hate. Things you've buried so deep, you've convinced yourself they don't exist. This is the shadow, the disowned self, the repository of everything you've rejected in order to be loved, to be safe, to be normal. Think about the last time you had a reaction that surprised you. A flash of rage over something trivial. A surge of jealousy you couldn't justify. A sudden cruelty toward someone who didn't deserve it. In that moment, the shadow surfaced. And instead of asking why, you probably pushed it back down. You apologized, rationalized, distracted yourself. You reasserted the persona. But Jung would say, that's the moment you should pay attention to, because the shadow is trying to tell you something. It's showing you a part of yourself that you've exiled. And until you bring it back, until you integrate it, you'll keep repeating the same patterns. You'll keep feeling that nameless dissatisfaction. You'll keep wondering why happiness feels so elusive. Because you're not whole. You're fragmented. You're at war with yourself. Jung believed that the path to psychological health wasn't about becoming more civilized, more controlled, more acceptable. It was about becoming more whole, about integrating the shadow, about acknowledging the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime denying. This process terrified most of his patients, because it meant admitting things they'd rather not admit, that they're capable of cruelty, that they harbor resentments they've never voiced, that they have desires that don't align with their self-image, that the person they've worked so hard to become is, in some ways, a lie. But Jung insisted, you can't heal what you won't acknowledge. You can't integrate what you refuse to see. And the cost of denial is a life spent performing, pretending, and wondering why nothing ever feels quite real. Your unhappiness isn't a flaw. It's a message. It's your psyche telling you that something is out of balance, that you've sacrificed too much of yourself for the sake of being acceptable, that the life you're living doesn't match the life you're capable of living. And until you stop running from your shadow, until you turn around and face the parts of yourself you've been taught to fear, that unhappiness will follow you everywhere. No achievement will satisfy it. No relationship will heal it. No distraction will silence it. Because it's not asking for more. It's asking for truth. In 1913, Carl Jung resigned from his academic positions and withdrew from public life. His colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. His wife worried he was losing his mind. And in a way, he was. But he was also doing something radical. He was descending into his own unconscious deliberately, like an archaeologist digging through layers of his psyche, looking for the fragments he'd buried. He kept journals filled with bizarre images, strange conversations, with figures that appeared in his mind. An old man he called Philemon. A feminine presence he named his anima. These weren't just fantasies. They were personifications of aspects of himself he'd never integrated. Parts of his psyche that had their own intelligence, their own voice, their own agenda. Most people would have dismissed this as delusion. Jung called it active imagination, and he believed it was essential, because the shadow isn't just personal. It's not just your individual baggage. Jung discovered that beneath your personal unconscious lies something deeper, the collective unconscious. A layer of the psyche that contains the archetypes, the universal patterns and symbols that appear in myths, dreams, and religions across all cultures. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow. These aren't inventions, they're structures. They're the psychological infrastructure of being human. And whether you're aware of them or not, they shape your life. Your unhappiness, Jung would say, often comes from living too small, from identifying only with your conscious ego, with your persona, with the narrow story you tell yourself about who you are. You think you're just you, but you're also connected to something vast, something ancient, something that transcends your individual existence. And when you cut yourself off from that depth, when you live entirely on the surface, you feel it. You feel the thinness, the lack of meaning, the sense that life is just a series of tasks and distractions with no real substance underneath. This is why Jung was so interested in mythology, in alchemy, in spirituality. Not because he was mystical, but because he understood that these symbolic systems were maps. They were ways humans had always tried to navigate the unconscious, ways of representing inner truths that couldn't be captured in literal language. And he saw that modern people had lost access to these maps. They'd traded myth for literalism, ritual for productivity, mystery for certainty. And in doing so, they'd become psychologically homeless. You see this everywhere now. People chasing goals that mean nothing to them because they don't know what else to do. People filling every moment with noise because silence feels unbearable. People medicating, distracting, optimizing, performing anything to avoid the confrontation with what's missing. But what's missing isn't out there. It's in here. It's the parts of yourself you've disowned, the shadow you won't face, the depth you're afraid to explore. Jung introduced a concept he called individuation. It's the process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who you've been conditioned to be. It's the lifelong work of integrating all the fragmented parts of yourself, the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow, the personal and the archetypal. Individuation isn't about self-improvement. It's not about becoming better according to some external standard. It's about becoming whole, about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away in order to be loved, to be accepted, to survive. And it's painful, because it requires you to give up the story you've been telling about yourself. The story where you're the good one, the victim, the hero, the misunderstood genius. Individuation asks you to see yourself clearly, without the comforting distortions of ego. Most people can't do this. They'd rather stay fragmented and familiar than risk the disorientation of wholeness. Jung had a patient once, a successful businessman who came to him with chronic anxiety and insomnia. On paper, the man had everything: wealth, status, a family. But he was miserable, and he didn't know why. Through analysis, Jung helped him see that his entire life was built around an image of success he de-inherited from his father. He'd never asked himself what he actually wanted. He'd spent decades performing a role, climbing a ladder he didn't choose, pursuing achievements that meant nothing to him. And buried beneath all that performance was a shadow self, a part of him that was creative, that wanted to paint, that had dreams he dismissed as impractical. A part of him that was softer, less competitive, less concerned with winning. But acknowledging that part meant admitting he'd wasted years. It meant risking his marriage, his career, his identity. It meant stepping into uncertainty. So he didn't do it. He thanked Jung, went back to his life, and numbed himself with work and alcohol until the anxiety became unbearable again. This is the tragedy Jung saw over and over. People would come to the edge of transformation, see what it required, and turn back, because the known suffering felt safer than the unknown freedom. Your unhappiness serves a purpose. It keeps you safe. It keeps you from having to change. It gives you something to blame for why your life isn't what you want it to be. And as long as you can point to external circumstances, bad luck, other people, you don't have to look inward. But Jung insisted, the external is a reflection of the internal. The patterns you keep encountering, the relationships that keep failing, the goals that keep disappointing, they're not random. They're symptoms of an inner split you refuse to address. You can't heal your life by changing your circumstances. You can only heal it by changing your relationship to yourself. And that means facing the shadow. It means asking uncomfortable questions. What am I pretending not to know? What parts of myself have I rejected? What desires have I buried? What anger have I swallowed? What grief have I avoided? These aren't abstract questions. They have concrete answers. And those answers are living in your unconscious, shaping your behavior, influencing your choices, creating the very unhappiness you're trying to escape. Jung believed that dreams were the primary way the unconscious communicates. They're not random. They're symbolic messages from the parts of yourself that don't have a voice in waking life. And most people ignore them. They wake up, dismiss the dream as nonsense, and move on. But Jung would say, pay attention, write them down. Look for the recurring symbols, the emotions, the figures. Because your dreams are trying to show you what you're missing. They're trying to guide you toward integration. The shadow appears in dreams as the dark figure, the threatening presence, the person you hate or fear. And the instinct is to run, to wake up, to forget. But Jung would say, turn around, face it, ask it what it wants, because it's not your enemy. It's the part of you that's been exiled, and it's trying to come home. This is the real reason you're unhappy, not because your life is wrong, but because you're living it at half capacity. You're operating from a narrow slice of who you are, and the rest of you is starving. And no amount of success or comfort or distraction will fix that, because what's missing isn't out there. It's in the parts of yourself you've learned to hate, to hide, to deny. Jung's promise was simple. Integrate the shadow, and you become free. Not free from suffering, but free to be yourself. Fully, unapologetically, without the constant exhaustion of maintaining a mask. In his later years, Jung built a tower by the lake in Bollingen, Switzerland. No electricity, no modern conveniences. Just stone, silence, and the lapping of water. He went there to think, to paint, to carve symbols into the walls. He went there to be alone with the parts of himself that the world didn't understand. He said the tower was a representation of his psyche. Each room a different layer. Each symbol a conversation with the unconscious. It wasn't an escape. It was a confrontation. A place where he could be whole without apology. Most people never build their tower. They never create a space, literal or psychological, where they can be honest with themselves. They spend their entire lives in performance mode, switching between roles, managing impressions, hiding what doesn't fit. And the cost of this is profound. Because when you don't know yourself, you can't trust yourself. You can't make decisions that align with your actual values because you don't know what those values are beneath the conditioning. You can't have authentic relationships because you don't know who you are when no one is watching. Jung introduced another crucial concept, the anima and animus. The anima is the unconscious feminine aspect in men. The animus is the unconscious masculine aspect in women. These aren't about gender in the cultural sense. They're about psychological balance. The anima represents emotionality, intuition, receptivity, the inner life. The animus represents logic, assertion, action, the outer life. And Jung believed that wholeness required integrating both, regardless of your gender. But most people are wildly out of balance. Men are taught to suppress their anima, to reject anything soft or emotional or receptive as weakness. Women are taught to suppress their animus, to avoid being too assertive or ambitious or independent. And this imbalance creates misery, because you need both. You need the capacity for feeling and the capacity for thinking, for yielding and for asserting, for introspection and for action. And when you cut off half of your psychological equipment, you hobble yourself. Jung saw this play out in relationships constantly. People projecting their undeveloped inner aspects onto their partners. Men expecting women to carry all the emotion, all the intuition, all the connection. Women expecting men to carry all the strength, all the direction, all the decision-making. And these projections create dependency, resentment, disappointment. Because you're asking another person to be the part of yourself you refuse to develop. And when they inevitably fail to live up to that impossible role, you blame them instead of recognizing the projection. Your unhappiness in relationships, Jung would say, is often a symptom of your relationship with yourself. If you haven't integrated your shadow, you'll project it onto your partner and hate them for mirroring what you can't accept in yourself. If you haven't integrated your anima or animus, you'll demand that your partner compensate for your psychological incompleteness. Real intimacy, Jung believed, is only possible between two people who are individuating, two people who are doing the work of becoming whole, because only then can you relate to another person as they actually are, rather than as a symbol of what you're missing. This is why Jung was skeptical of happiness as a goal. He didn't think the point of life was to be happy. He thought the point was to be conscious, to become aware of the forces shaping you, to bring the unconscious into consciousness, to integrate the fragmented parts of yourself into a coherent whole. And sometimes that process is deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes it brings grief, anger, confusion, disillusionment. Sometimes it requires you to let go of people, careers, beliefs that no longer serve your becoming. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is a life spent asleep, a life where you're driven by forces you don't understand, repeating patterns you can't break, numbing a dissatisfaction you can't name. Jung talked about the second half of life as the time when this work becomes unavoidable. In the first half, you build, you achieve, you establish yourself in the world, you play the game. And for many people, that's enough. The external markers of success provide sufficient distraction. But then, somewhere in midlife, the distraction stops working. The achievements feel hollow. The roles feel confining. The persona you've spent decades perfecting starts to feel like a prison. This is what we call a midlife crisis. But Jung would say it's not a crisis. It's an invitation. An invitation to turn inward, to reckon with the shadow, to begin the process of individuation that you've been avoiding. Some people accept the invitation. They dismantle their lives, confront their illusions, and rebuild from a place of deeper truth. It's messy, it's painful, but they emerge more whole, more authentic, more alive. Others refuse. They double down on the persona. They buy the sports car, have the affair, throw themselves into work, anything to avoid the confrontation. And they spend the rest of their lives running from a conversation with themselves that never stops pursuing them. Jung believed that the unconscious is compensatory, that it tries to balance whatever the conscious ego is overdoing. If you're too rational, the unconscious sends irrational impulses. If you're too controlled, it sends chaos. If you're too identified with being good, it sends shadow material that forces you to reckon with your capacity for darkness. And you can fight this compensation. You can repress, suppress, ignore. But the unconscious is patient. It will keep sending the message in different forms until you listen. This is why the same problems keep showing up in your life. The same relationship dynamics, the same career frustrations, the same self-sabotage. Not because you're unlucky, but because you haven't learned what your unconscious is trying to teach you. And what it is trying to teach you is this: you are not who you think you are. You're more complex, more contradictory, more mysterious than your ego can comprehend. And the path to wholeness isn't through control. It's through surrender. Surrender to the process of becoming. Surrender to the discomfort of not knowing. Surrender to the shadow, to the anima, to the archetypes that are trying to guide you home to yourself. Jung spent his life mapping the territory of the psyche, not to give answers, but to show that there's a journey, that the inner world is as vast and unexplored as the outer world, and that most people spend their entire lives living on the surface, never realizing the depth that's available to them. Your unhappiness is the call to that depth. It's your psyche saying, there's more. You're living too small. You've buried too much. You've settled for a shallow version of existence when a richer, fuller, more authentic life is possible. But it requires courage. The courage to stop performing. The courage to look at the parts of yourself you've hidden. The courage to admit that the life you've built might not be the life you actually want. And most people don't have that courage. So they stay unhappy, quietly, tolerably, telling themselves it's just how life is. But Jung knew better, and he spent his life offering an alternative. Carl Jung died in 1961 at his home in Kusnacht, overlooking the lake. He was 85. In his final years, he was still writing, still exploring, still corresponding with people all over the world who were trying to understand the depths he'd mapped. He never claimed to have all the answers. He said his work was a beginning, not an end. That each person's psyche was unique. That there was no formula for wholeness. Only principles and a willingness to explore. And what he left behind wasn't a system. It was an invitation. An invitation to take your inner life seriously. To stop dismissing your dreams, your impulses, your patterns as meaningless. To recognize that your unhappiness is not a flaw to be fixed, but a signal to be heeded. The real reason you're unhappy, Jung would say, is that you're living in exile from yourself. You've constructed a socially acceptable persona and mistaken it for your identity. You've buried the shadow so deep, you've forgotten it's there. You've projected your undeveloped aspects onto the world and wondered why nothing satisfies. And the solution isn't out there. It's not in the next achievement, the next relationship, the next change of scenery. It's in the confrontation you've been avoiding. The one with the parts of yourself you've learned to fear, to deny, to hate. This confrontation isn't comfortable. It will challenge everything you thought you knew about yourself. It will show you capacities for cruelty, for pettiness, for weakness that don't fit your self-image. It will reveal desires and fears you've never voiced. It will force you to admit that you're not the hero of your own story. You're just a person trying to make sense of forces you barely understand. But it will also liberate you. Because when you stop fighting the shadow, when you stop pretending to be simpler than you are, you reclaim your energy. You stop living in constant tension between who you are and who you're pretending to be. And you discover something surprising. The shadow isn't as terrifying as you thought. The desires you've buried aren't evil, they're just human. The anger you've suppressed isn't monstrous, it's informative. The weakness you've hidden isn't shameful, it's vulnerable. Integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse. It means acknowledging that the impulse exists. It means giving it a voice, understanding where it comes from, and making a conscious choice about what to do with it. When you do this, you become whole. Not perfect, not enlightened, just whole. And wholeness has a quality that nothing else can provide: authenticity. The sense that you're living from your center rather than from a script, that your choices are yours, that your life, whatever it looks like, belongs to you. Jung believed that this process of individuation wasn't just personal. It was essential for the health of society, because fragmented people create fragmented communities. People who can't face their own shadow project it onto others. They create enemies, scapegoats, others to blame for the darkness they won't acknowledge in themselves. And entire cultures can operate this way, repressing the shadow collectively, projecting it onto different races, nations, ideologies, creating wars, atrocities, oppression, all in the name of fighting an evil that's actually internal. The work of facing your shadow, then, isn't selfish. It's one of the most generous things you can do. Because when you integrate your darkness, you stop adding to the world's darkness. You stop projecting. You stop blaming. You take responsibility for your own psychological state and stop demanding that the world conform to your illusions. This is the hidden truth Jung discovered. That your unhappiness is a gift, not in some sentimental, everything happens for a reason sense, but in the sense that it's trying to wake you up, to alert you that something is out of alignment, that you're living too far from your center, that the persona you're maintaining costs more than it's worth. And if you listen to that unhappiness instead of numbing it, if you follow it inward instead of projecting it outward, it will lead you somewhere real. Somewhere that doesn't promise perpetual happiness, but offers something better. Depth, meaning, authenticity, wholeness. Jung's work doesn't offer quick fixes. It doesn't promise that if you do certain exercises or follow certain steps, you'll be happy. It says something more challenging and more true. If you commit to the lifelong process of becoming conscious, of integrating the shadow, of individuating, you'll become yourself. And being yourself, fully and without apology, is worth more than any amount of curated happiness. You can spend your entire life chasing happiness and never find it. Because happiness, as it's usually conceived, is a state that depends on external conditions. And external conditions are always changing, always unstable, always outside your control. But wholeness is different. Wholeness is internal. It's the sense that you're not at war with yourself, that the different parts of you are in dialogue rather than in combat, that you can hold complexity without needing to resolve it into false simplicity. This is what Jung offered. Not a cure for unhappiness, but a path through it. A way of relating to your psyche that honors its depth, its mystery, its autonomy. The question he leaves you with is simple. Are you willing to look? Are you willing to stop blaming your circumstances and start examining your patterns? Are you willing to face the parts of yourself you spent your life avoiding? Are you willing to give up the comfort of victimhood and accept the responsibility of wholeness? Most people aren't, and that's okay. The unconscious is patient. It will keep knocking. Through symptoms, through dreams, through the same painful patterns repeating until you finally turn around and ask, "What are you trying to tell me?" And when you do, when you finally stop running and start listening, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually you start to feel less fragmented, less at war, less like you're performing a role, and more like you're living a life. You start to notice the moments when the shadow surfaces, and instead of pushing it away, you get curious. You start to pay attention to your dreams and see the symbols, the themes, the guidance they offer. You start to recognize your projections and withdraw them, relating to people as they are rather than as symbols of your inner drama. And slowly, you individuate. You become more yourself, not the self you were taught to be. The self you actually are beneath all the conditioning and fear and performance. Jung's hidden truth is that your unhappiness isn't the problem. Your refusal to listen to it is. If this opened your eyes, subscribe to Boring History, because the truth is never boring.